All
Yeah.
right. So let me start a little personal stuff. Do you have any kind of writing routine, or how do you manage your administrative and political issues with the poetry? How does that work? Is there a system, or it just depends on the day and what you need to do?
Well, I've always, for most of my life, I've had a day job as a civil engineer. So,
Oh, you
um,
started? Okay.
yeah. So, I've usually reserved the night for creative stuff, for writing. So I try to maintain that same kind of routine, like sort of take care of all the business end of my career as a poet and teaching as well during the day, and try to reserve my evenings for creativity or creative projects, not just poetry, but other kinds of projects too. I'm basically, I've been a night owl since my early 20s, and I just can't, I just can't write during the day. It's just not in me. So, but you find that most writers are one or the other. They either really like to write really early in the morning or late at night, and I think it's for the same reasons. When you have that sort of serenity or quiet, when you can put the world, at rest and just concentrate on your work.
Oh, okay. Interesting. In terms of your writing process here, uh, is there any routine you have? Or like, do you write the whole poem down? Do you write a couple lines, look at it, or it really depends on the poem?
Every poem sort of has a different kind of, well, I should say every poem sort of begins more or less the same. The trajectory is very different. Sometimes it comes easier, sometimes it takes months. But usually I begin, uh, I keep a notebook, a small little notebook, nothing, nothing too fancy, and I try to record there moments that capture me, moments when I'm moved, moments that I'm touched, and that might be anything from watching a squirrel to, like, being at McDonald's. Who knows when the muse or strikes, and then I try to just record that, that raw emotional sort of reaction to something, and then I'll start a poem when I can. um, and it's not always right after. Sometimes it's weeks after. And I just begin a poem by doing fever writing, usually on the computer, just writing, and like non-edited, no self-editing, no spelling, nothing, just throwing jello on the wall to see what sticks, just words, images. If it's a memory poem, just trying to think about, what were the details of that memory. And I'm kind of just, what that does for me is two things. One, it sort of, um, it sort of exercises all that, exorcises all that garbage language that's in our head from the day to day, just breaking free of the expected language, the expected responses to something, so that I start digging deeper and deeper into real emotion or my real subconscious. Um, and as that happens, usually there's an image or a line or um, a phrase or something that I can tell that's Richard Blanco, the poet. And then something I can trust, and then I start building the poem around that, and start, then, it's just the beginning still, but there's a direction, and then I try to find a strategy. Is that repetition? Is that a fixed form? Is that is this a short lyric? Is this going to be a longer narrative poem? And then start looking for a structure or length, all those other parameters of a poem. So I compare it a lot to sort of, like writing a song, or playing a song, where you're kind of tuning your guitar for a while until you find that right note, and you realize, okay, now I can start playing the song, or I can start writing the song because my guitar is tuned. So
Careful.
it
Yeah.
feels like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, okay. Well, I'll get a little more philosophical here and poetic. Uh, you write a lot about your personal experiences, of course. So here's the question: how do you move from biography to poetry?
There is a point in that very process where, well, let me explain. Let me explain. Let me start by explaining it this way. As I tell my students,
Sure.
writing a poem is one of the most arrogant, stupidest, selfish, dumbest things you can do in the world. And
Mhm.
writing a poem is also one of the most selfless, gregarious, important things you can do in the world. And what I mean by that is that a poem does begin, it has to begin in that impassioned, that sort of self-centered space where, you know, you feel like your word, your life, your emotions are worth words. But in the process of making art, and this is the difference between people that perhaps just journal, the process of making art, of adhering to the techniques of craft, there comes a moment where you transcend the very stuff that you come to the page with, and the poem starts becoming its own thing. And like it's there, there's an artistic persona that takes over, and you understand that you're making art. Now, it can still be very personal, but you're understanding a deeper sense of the universality of your experience, and you're working the poem to sort of deliver that. So, and that's where a poem can sort of just stray away from from facts, you know, like, and just stray into the imaginative. I always say a poem, in the end of the day, is an act of imagination, right? It's not a newspaper article. It's not an encyclopedia entry. It is, it's wherever your creativity and the art takes you. And I think that, you know, that making art is what transcends the autobiographical and makes it universal. Not every poem does that to the same degree of success, but definitely there's a point where you know you're not just writing for yourself, and that you are, again, making art.
Okay, yeah, that's a great answer, and that's a real challenge for especially beginning poets who just say, not very poetically, what's going on there.
Yeah, you know, there's a difference between just pure self-expression and making art, and I often compare it to, you know, it's one thing to sort of, you know, throw a football in the backyard, you know, fool, you know, play a game of tag, versus, you know, being a professional athlete and practicing, you know, 5 hours a day. Or you could take that in any context, as a dancer, as a anything, you know, it takes a commitment to something larger than yourself.
That's the key. Yeah. Okay. I want to talk a bit about identity politics, which is really, I think maybe in Miami especially, is an issue. Like, uh, you're Hispanic, you're gay, and you're an immigrant, I guess, right? You came here
Yeah.
when you were young. Uh, so when you're writing, and this comes through in your poems, as you write, do you see yourself as any one of those things, or you just see yourself as this voice that transcends or incorporates all of that? Does that question
I
make
mean,
a little sense?
yeah, I mean, of course, you see yourself for those things, but again, the art makes you sort of investigate, well, what's what's the common human denominator here, right? Like, what is the common emotion? And for me, really, all those things, being an immigrant, being Latino, being gay, is really really comes down to questions of home, place, belonging, and identity, like you said. And everybody struggles with those in their own way, right?
Yes.
You know, in some ways, you know, you don't have to be an immigrant to sort of have an immigrant experience. You know, you can, you know, you move from Chicago to Miami, you're going to have an immigrant
Oh, yeah.
experience, right? Right. Or from Miami to Arizona, you know, like, so, I mean, different foods, different histories. So I think we're constantly negotiating our sense of self and our sense of place, even, and that also as a gay man, I mean, you're constantly negotiating that throughout your life. And so that's what I sort of try to tap into, like, okay, here's the specifics of my life, but it also is a universal feeling. You know, like Frost famously said, the universal is in the particular. And you know, we basically, as human beings, we basically feel the same five emotions, right? And the, you know, the window dressing changes, but it's the same thing.
Uh, well, it's funny because I listened to your poem for Obama's inauguration, and I just saw how you did something really nice. You had the particular, and it became the universal, and it
Right.
was really thrilling. And yeah, and the way you moved from not only different vocations but different areas, and it really came through. One sky, one coach, one country, our way. Do you want to talk a bit about the challenges and how you feel now about the poem that you wrote? Because
Sure.
that's an occasional poem, which is always fraught with some challenges.
Sure. There's several things I could speak to about that. One is well, I'll take a cue from you. So there are very specific images. But one of the challenges of that poem in particular is that it's not necessarily it's not completely autobiographical. It isn't overtly autobiographical, right?
No.
So when you're talking about a poem that's supposed to be so inclusive, the images are specific, but they're not too specific where it would exclude. And I'll
Yeah.
give you an example, like when I talk about people waking up to the day on their way to do X, Y, or Z, clean tables, right, is something that could, yes, it's a server, but it could also be a mother, it could also be other things, right? So I didn't say clean tables at Denny's, like I didn't want to be too specific. Or read ledgers, right? Ledgers could be an accountant, could be a lawyer, it could be so many different kinds of jobs, right? So I didn't want to say like to go to court or to count debits and credits, right? So that was a bit of a challenge, whereas ordinarily I would write more specifically out of more specific autobiographical experiences or memories. That's one thing. The other thing was that poem was really, now that I have thought about it, was in a way my first spoken word poem
Ah,
written. Yeah, the first I've ever written that I knew would be heard before it ever be read. And I knew that if it didn't catch through the ear, that there wasn't going to be much interest in the poem. So I wouldn't say that I dumbed it down, but I tried to distill everything so that it could be taken in by the ear and not overly complicate things, because wanted, and I don't believe that accessibility and complexity are antonyms. In fact, I think the best poems take something very complex and make it accessible. But I purposely went back through a pass of it and, like, you know what? People are not really going to understand this metaphor the way it's written through the ear. So how can I distill it, right? How can I make it more digestible, so to speak? So that was another challenge. The challenge of a occasional poem in general, as I learned from writing that poem and from many others that I've done now, is that they always say occasional poem is a kiss of death, and I don't
yeah.
never really understood that. And
I
I
was,
think,
I was a little reluctant to even bring it up, but I'm glad I
yeah,
did.
no, I think it's a great conversation, because it's not the kiss of death. I think people misunderstand. I think writers misunderstand what an occasional poem is. It's not just about the occasion. It's about what the poet feels about the occasion that may have something in common with the audience with which you are sharing that poem. So um, there, in earlier versions of the poem, I didn't include my mother or my father or myself in the poem, and it was just kind of this talking head, and it was like this narrative distance. And after some feedback from my close readers, I went back and put in very autobiographical moments in the poem, because no, this is what I feel about the poem and this country as well. My voice matters in this poem, and so it's it is about the occasion, but it's not solely
Oh, it's frozen.
about
Okay.
the occasion. Now, if you extend that, even personal poems are doing the same thing, right? I feel something about my life, which is an occasion. My father died. That's an occasional poem. Like, how can I share that in a way that like, getting back to your question of process, how can I write that in a way that conveys that, but also transcends that and connects with an audience? We're constantly doing that in every poem. So I consider in some ways every poem is an occasional poem in some way, because you're writing about something. um, the only difference is that you actually have the actual
A
audience
little bit.
there, and so that's interesting. But in a way, who cares? I mean, like, when people ask who my audience is, like, anybody that can breathe and read, like, I don't write for, and you do write with the sense that there are people going to read and listen to this poem. So it's not really all that different. You know, there's going to be people that read that poem beyond the million people on the mall and the 40 million on TV. So, and I've taught classes about that because I think it also does a great service to put poetry out there, you know, in places that are not typically where you don't typically find poetry. So I always tell people, you know, if you like a politician or something and they get inaugurated as mayor, offer to write a poem for their inauguration or anything. You know, think of occasions to bring poetry to people and add to the significance of certain moments. Write a poem for your godchild's, you know, um,
Sure.
baptism, you know, something. And poetry has always been, it's in its DNA, right? Poetry's always been, for many
Right.
more hundreds of years before I was on the page, was really the proverbial campfire, the way we shared experiences collectively, right?
Good. I used to tell my students, I mean, instinctively, you play with language. Like I remember playing tennis, and somebody says, "There's no bout to doubt it." You know, not, it does it automatically. It's
Right.
funny. My students who hated poetry, there was a vice principal, a real nasty guy who got. His name was Dick. He lost an eye in a hunting accident, so they all called him Dead Eye Dick. There you go. You got it. Okay. Hey, listen, we got to have you. Do you have your book here? Because I'd love you to read and talk about a poem of yours, at least
Uh,
one.
yeah, I'll just pull it up on the screen.
Okay. I love the humor of betting on America. Can you access that one?
Yeah.
Okay, let me get it too. What page was that on? Uh,
I'll see it in a minute.
I got 94 in your book, Betting on America.
Uh, yeah, I have it on 95 for some reason, but
Oh, yeah.
this is the digital version.
Yeah, I got it 95 too.
Sure.
Okay.
So this
Want to talk
poem,
about it first?
yeah, this poem was, you know, something that, you know, sometimes you just, you know, those memories you have that just never, you always come back to them. They never leave you, and every once in a while they pop up, and and you're not sure why you keep on remembering this. And then this poem was one of those poems where I remember the Miss America pageant was a really huge deal at my family. And so, I mean, relatives would come over, potluck. My grandmother, as you see in this poem, would set up a betting pool. I mean, it was a production. And I think it stayed with me because as a kid, I was probably wondering, though I didn't have language for it, was like, why are they so into Miss America when they're Cuban? Like, and they want to go back to Cuba. Why are they so interested in this very American thing?
So
And
that's
why was I, right? And so I think we were both,
uh,
whether me as, you know, as being raised here and in Miami, and them as more, you know, my parents came here obviously as adults and more immigrant than I am, so to speak. But we were both trying to understand America by this kind of celebration, or this kind of spectacle, if you will.
all right. By the way,
Okay.
it's so rich for humor and irony, and you do it beautifully.
Yeah.
Okay, let
All
us
right.
see it. I'm there. I'm watching it. Okay.
Okay. Betting on America. My grandmother was the bookie set up at the kitchen table that night, her hair in curlers, pencil and pad jotting down $2 bets, paying 5-1 on which Miss would take the crown. Abuelo put his money on Miss Wyoming. She's got great teeth, he pronounced, as if complimenting a horse. Not her smile filling the camera before she whisked away like a cloud in her creamy chiffon dress. I dug up enough change from the sofa and car seats to bet on Miss Wisconsin, thinking I was as American as she was because I was as blonde, and I knew that's where all the cheese came from. That wasn't all. Chocolate was from Miss Pennsylvania. The capital of Miss Montana was Helena. Mount Rushmore was in Miss South Dakota. And I knew how to say Miss Connecticut. Unlike my tia Gloria, who just pointed at the TV. Esa, that one, claiming she had her same figure before leaving Cuba. It's true. I have pictures, she declared, before cramming another bocadito sandwich into her mouth. Papa refused to bet on any of the misses because Americanas all have skinny butts, he complained. There's nothing like a big culo cubano. Everyone agreed. Es verdad, es verdad. except for me and my little cousin Julito, who apparently was a breast man at age 5, reaching for Miss Alabama's bosom on the screen, the leggy mulata sashaying in pumps, swimsuit, seducing Tio Pedro into picking her as a short winner. She's the one. She looks cubana, he swore. And she did, but she cost him $5. Cojones, he exploded as confetti rained down. Bert Parks leading Miss Ohio, the new Miss America, by the hand to the runway. Gloves up to her elbows, velvet down to her feet, crying diamonds into her bouquet. The queen of our country, our land of the free, amid the purple mountains of her majesty, floating across the stage and our living room. Though no one bet on her, and none of us, not even me, could answer Mama when she asked, Chico, where is Ohio?
Wow. There's so much to talk about here. But you as the child, with the experience, there's such an interesting idea, the children's view of it and the parents. But I look at the line, she, because thinking I was in America. So you're trying to up your parents a bit. You're more American than they are
Right.
at this point. Any comments on that whole dynamic of you seem to adjust to America much easier than the parents, obviously. And that
Yeah,
conflict
obviously.
runs through a lot of poems. You want to talk
Yeah,
about that at all? The way it works in your
it's
poems?
sure. Yeah, it's a bit more there's more dimension to it. I think that's part of what I
Yeah.
try to tell in my stories is that in my poems is that I think people misunderstand that immigrants or children of immigrants immediately embrace their given culture. And, like any good blood-hearted good old kid, you don't want to be your parents, whether they're Cuban or Peruvian or as American as apple pie. You don't want to listen to their music. You don't want to dress like them. And so in part, it's really what I call a coming of age story. It's a process that you go through. I wouldn't say you reject your given culture,
Oh, no.
but you also want to be part of this country in the ways that perhaps your parents don't or can't understand. And so it's a constant sort of, I wouldn't say struggle, not even tension, but it's just a dynamic. And so the parents want you to be quote unquote American too, but they also don't want you to stray too far away from your traditions and your culture. And so we find that especially first generation immigrants, they're always trying to navigate those two worlds. And so and yeah, I mean, it wasn't actually till I started writing itself that I was able to appreciate my given culture and realize that I had all these questions that I didn't even know I had growing up my whole life. This is all in retrospect. And realizing, like I said, I went back to this poem because I was still like, why do I remember that so vividly? Why did it implant itself
Yeah.
in my subconscious or in my conscious mind? And here I am. Okay, now I finally figured out what that dynamic was about, what watching the Miss America meant for me, as also how what it meant in contrast to my parents, my grandparents, and the older relatives.
Yeah, and you use a humorous tone for that too, which is interesting. But I want you to reread because you move to the last two stanzas, and there's a bit of a leap there, which I find really interesting and really well done because we focus now on the person without the interaction and the humor. So do you want to read that again? Because it really focuses on here's Miss America, and maybe talk about that. So start off again with gloves to her elbows.
Yep, sure.
Gloves up to.
I'll start a little bit earlier because I
Oh,
think
yeah,
it's
whatever
nice.
you think
Yeah.
is good.
Bert Parks leading Miss Ohio, the new Miss America, by the hand to the runway, gloves up to her elbows, velvet down to her feet, crying diamonds into her bouquet, the queen of our country, our land of the free, amid the purple mountains of her majesty, floating across the stage and our living room, though no one bet on her, and none of us, not even me, could answer Mama when she asked, Chico, where is Ohio?
Yeah, that's a. Uh, so there seems to be a difference tone, obviously, and there's this our country, our land of the free. So it's almost like you're absorbing this here, and you move from humor to something else. Do you want to talk a bit about that ending? And then you end with Donde Est Ohio. So that's very rich. But there's a humor, but something else going on. Do you have anything else to add to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a poetic technique of sort of zeroing in on the imagery
Yeah.
of the Miss America, but there Miss America becomes emblematic
Yes.
of America, and so the idea of, you know, here, this is America, right? Like she represents that in our psyche at that moment, and then the turn or the closure is that basically no matter how close we get to sort of feeling that as our country, both for my parents, my relatives, my grandparents, and myself, there's still an impasse because my mother and I really have no idea where Ohio is. Like, so it's this mythic idea that we're thinking we're understanding something about the country that we are in, the country that we've adopted or that has adopted us, and yet there's a bit of a disconnection as well.
Yeah. So I'm just, yeah, this is a personal question. Like when you're writing these poems, uh, especially with you and your father, grandmother, does that bring back memories? And did you have more of a distance to it then? You find it more humorous than you were as the child? Was there some
Um,
kind of frustration with them or anger or I can't speak for you, but
no,
my question makes sense
I don't think I don't think that I was necessarily making judgments
as a
at
kid.
that age as a kid. I think it's
Oh,
just
okay.
taking it all in and absorbing things, and then like I said, it's the writing that makes me sort of. Anna Easton famously said that writers taste life twice, and I think the act of writing, the act of writing poetry especially, is to go back to those moments in life, and see what you were feeling, which you had no words to articulate with, or maybe it was just something that was affecting or imprinting your subconscious, um, that then you can go back to like a little time machine and relive that moment as best you can through poetry, and yeah, and just sort of understand what that meant in your life, reconstruct it in your life in a way, or really what you're feeling at this moment, of course, um, you know, stems from the sum of your experiences, but you know, poets go back to see where they came from. And that way it's a bit like, you know, the way therapy is practiced, although poetry is not therapy in my book, it's therapeutic, but it's really, yeah, just investigating your life, and um so that you can understand your present.
Yeah. By the way, Florida is one of the few places, I don't know, it's I heard they have a degree in poetry therapy where you help people deal
Yeah,
with
yeah,
poetry.
I've spoken
Oh yeah.
at their conferences, and I
Wow.
contemplated, I've contemplated uh many years ago, contemplated getting licenses of poetry or bibliotherapy, and it is quite fascinating how they use it now. they they use the poem as a way to open a door
Right.
to a discussion, an emotion. I don't, as far as I know, it's not about writing poetry per se, but it's more using the poem as a as a launching pad, so to speak, or as a
Exploration.
point of departure for, because poetry can uncover so many emotions in us, right? It's like
Yes.
song. It can, you know, it can bring out so many things of our own lives. And it's used, yeah, it's pretty brilliant the way it works.
Yeah. By the way, is Debbie Babiatsky, who was very instrumental, do you know her at all? She used to be called Debbie Grayson. Never heard of her? She
I
was. Oh, okay.
I think she might have been. This year I actually spoke this year, but it was virtual.
Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, I gotta get you. I think we got a couple minutes, but there's another poem which really I find excellent called "Matters of the Sea." That moves to a different register. I am thinking on 128.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know that one obviously, right?
Yeah. I know them all.
Yeah. Whoa. Okay, 128. I got to get to it too. Yes, yes, sir. Okay.
Wait,
Yeah,
so did you want me to read that or?
yeah, and we can talk about it briefly.
Sure.
You might.
Now, is this going to be a printed or audio interview? I forget.
I think maybe, but it's definitely audio.
Oh, okay. So, but it'll be edited, right? Somewhat or no?
It's audio, and Michael does edit the video. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
If
because
you
it
take a deep
just
breath and give us your best resonant voice.
yeah.
All right.
Yeah, Matters of the Sea was the State Department asked me to write a poem for the reopening of the U.S. Embassy in Havana in August
Yeah.
of 2015. And this is what I came up with. I was thinking of the sea, not as a thing that divides us, but as a thing that can also unite us. Because, you know, figuratively speaking, metaphorically speaking, we're both we're both connected by the water, right? But also the sea is as both protagonist and antagonist in some ways. And yeah, so here we go. The sea doesn't matter. What matters is this. We all belong to the sea between us, all of us. Once and still the same child who marvels over starfish, listens to hollow shells, sculpts dreams into impossible sand. Sorry, need to start that over again. The sea doesn't matter. What matters is this. We all belong to the sea between us. All of us, once and still the same child who marvels over starfish, listens to hollow shells, sculpts dreams into impossible castles. We've all been lovers, holding hands, strolling either of our shores. Our footprints, like a mirage of selves, vanished in waves that don't know their birth or care which country they break. They break. Bless us. Return to the sea, home to our silent wishes. No one is the other, to the sea. Whether unhemmed island or vast continent, remember our grandfathers, their hands dug deep into red or brown earth, planting maple or mango trees that outlived them. Our grandmothers counting years while dusting photos of their weddings, brittle family faces still alive on our dressers now. Our mothers teaching us how to read in Spanish or English, how to tie our shoes, how to gather false colors or bite into guavas. Our fathers worn by the weight of clouds, clocking in at factories or cutting sugarcane to earn a new life for us. My cousins and I now scouting the same stars above skyscrapers or palms, waiting for time to stop and begin again when rain falls, washes its way through river or street back to the sea. No matter what anthem we sing, we've all walked barefoot and bare-souled among the soar and dive of seagull cries. We've offered our sorrows, hopes up to the sea, our lips anointed by the same spray of salt-laden wind. We've fingered our memories and regrets like stones in our hands we can't toss. Yet, we've all cupped seashells to our ears. Listen again to the echo. The sea still telling us the end of our doubts and fears is to gaze into the lucid blues of our shared horizon, breathe together, heal
Wow.
together.
Yeah. Sorry for that. My goodness. And here we got this direct statement at the beginning. The sea doesn't belong, doesn't matter. What matters is this, semicolon. You want to talk about that as an introduction and how that you chose that as a beginning?
Yeah, again, it's subverting the idea of the sea that divides us and turning it into the sea that unites us.
Exactly. Yeah.
Turning on its toe.
That's so assertive, though. What matters is this.
That's poetic emotional authority. Yes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Okay.
And then also, it was interesting because, of course, well, I don't know, everything Cuban always so laden with politics, but I got a lot of beef for that because they didn't quite get the metaphor there, and they were thinking, well, what about all the people that drowned in the sea trying to fight? I'm like, That's not what I'm
Yeah.
talking about. Like, it's like, I think I could have written roses are red, violets are blue, and they would have still found something to critique uh, on the far right conservative end.
Yeah. Another quote you're interesting about in terms of your poems. They're not lyric. They're long, fluid lines. I think you talked a bit about this. How do you know when to break the lines in enjambments? It's mainly ear, I'm thinking, or most of the ear.
Um, Not necessarily. It's partly a couple things are happening as we modulate the poetic line, so to speak.
Whoa.
um, One is your line length. So I have kind of a line length that I feel that's my unit in the way that I hear language, in the way
Yeah,
that I
okay.
understand language. So you'll notice that most of my lines in every poem and from poem to poem are more or less the same length and visually. I don't know, but not necessarily syllabically, but probably close because they're probably close in number of syllables. And then so I'm sort of playing with that, but then also I want the line break, the last word or phrase of that line to sort of have some kind of resonance, have some kind of energy, have some kind of add to some sense of what the poem is trying to do. So if you take that first line of this poem, the sea doesn't matter, what matters is this, colon, that to me felt like a very dramatic, important
Yes.
thing to do, is like end that line on a colon. And it's also natural because then you're going to get a list, right? So why begin the list on that line, right? But it's also, I want a certain line length, so I have to fill it in with imagery or language that I that I want and like. So yeah, and that goes moment by moment, line by line. It's kind of like a little bit of a sort of a problem solving or puzzle, where you're trying to work within the parameter of your line length, and also sort of also trying to create line breaks that have interest. And
Yeah, that's a challenge.
and that's my default, but sometimes there are poems that demand something differently. Shorter lines, um, or it's lines that are spread across the page, or the typography changes. I can left justify it. I mean, right justify it, or something. You also play with that, as long as it's sort of justified by the subject matter or the mood or the tone of the poem, that it makes sense to make that artistic choice. And then of course stanzas are very important too, right? Like how do you organize as a group of images? How do you move from one stanza to another? How does that transition happen, and why does it happen? So yeah, so stanza also plays into that. I don't usually like, a 2-line stanza, then a 10-line stanza, then a 3-line stanza, and then a 4-line stanza, and then 10-line stanza. Like there has to be some kind of structure and logic in the ways that you build stanzas.
Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah. Are you working now on any projects that are exciting you, or is that not to be stated publicly yet?
I have a play that's going to premiere.
Right.
Uh,
Woo.
Not premiere. It's opening night. It already premiered in Portland, Maine. But it'll open in Miami at the Actors Playhouse in Miracle Theater on November 10th. So that's very exciting. It's a play about takes place in Maine, but it's about a Cuban American that moves to Maine, and sort of same kinds of themes and questions in my poetry about home, place, identity, community, the families we have, the families we make, the way we find ourselves connected to place, or disconnected. So that's very exciting. And then, yeah, I would say that's the most immediate thing. I have working on a musical as a co-lyricist, but that project is very, very far away. That's just in its infancy. So it's not worth so much talking about it right now. This might not be 5 years before we see it on stage. So
Boy, you're busy and ambitious and like challenges.
Yeah, well, as long as
Why not?
as long as I'm ticking, you
Yeah.
never know, you never know what's around the corner. But also I think it's partly uh not only do I enjoy what I do, but I also I have the attention span of a mosquito. So like I'd love to do many different things because I get bored easily doing the same thing over and over again. So that's why I'm a civil engineer and became a poet and an architect. And yeah, so I'd love to try anything that's creative. I'm also working on a TV script for a pilot script for uh, my memoir, The Prince of Los Cucuyos, which is a Miami childhood, is a full title, which company brought the option the rights for the memoir for a TV series, but also made me a writer on the series. So that's exciting. And then of course there is this new book, Homeland of My Body, which is my first. It feels like a new project because it's so new, right? But it's my first new and selected kind of collection or volume, and that was interesting to do in the sense of looking back at all your work and seeing how it ties into the work that I'm doing right now and the new poems that are printed in this book. And there's quite a bit of them. There's 30 of them. So it was really interesting to sort of see where my sense of home, place, and belonging, where those themes have evolved to, in which now, as the title suggests, the homeland of my body,
Yeah.
I'm coming to feel like home is something that exists within me, not outside of me. So the book is sort of challenging traditional notions of home in the sense that it's a physical place or a city or something that we live in, but rather it lives in us. And it's the sum total of all our experiences of homes gained or lost, that they all sort of blend together to create a sense of home in us, but also that art itself, in a way, is a home. I've come to realize that the 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 making of art, the community of artists, is also a kind of home that I had never really contemplated as, again, not a tangible place, but a place that lives in our psyche, in our bodies, and in our minds.
I'm exhausted just listening to you. Very quickly, are you doing any more writing workshops?
Um, Not at the moment because I'm teaching at FIU, so most of the writing workshops happen in the summer, and there will be a few. I don't have exact dates, but there'll be one in Maine that will be in person that I know of, and another one in San Antonio, which is the last week of July, I believe, which is through Macondo Writers Workshop, which is an organization that welcomes Latinx writers and supports Latinx writers with Latinx instructors, sort of a Cave Canem kind of organization, but for Latinx writers of all kinds, poets, screenwriters, novelists. So that's at the end of July. That's all I know of so far. Yeah, most of the workshops happen in the summer.
That's a pretty good list of things. Listen, it's a pleasure talking. By the way, you bring back good memories of that workshop. We had a lot of fun in it. And I wish you nothing but the best in your future career.
Sure,
And
Gary. So I must have given you the line modulation of the poetic line lecture, right? About how working with lines and
yeah,
stuff. Yeah. So
yeah.
it's all there. Yeah.
I
All
just
right.
wonder, how many different cells do you have here? Do you? I mean, the things you're doing are just overwhelming. You have.
Oh yeah.
Do you have
On
so
top of
many?
teaching, on top of teaching and traveling about half of my life to for events
Yeah.
and appearances, keynote speaking and school visits and all the rest. But hey, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. I want to die in a plane writing a poem. So
Yeah.
Richard, thank
All
you.
the
You've
best to
been
you, and I'm
brilliant.
looking forward to seeing you. You're
all right,
everywhere.
Gary. Thanks. And thanks, Lenny.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye bye.